Welcome in, everybody. Today we're doing a deep dive into something I think is super interesting. The history of sourdough. You know, we hear about it all the time.
Oh, absolutely. Especially these days, it feels like everybody and their brother has a sourdough starter going.
Uh-huh, right. But I feel like most people don't really know much about it beyond, how to bake it.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So for this deep dive, we're going to kind of unearth that history and see what we can discover.
Awesome.
I was doing a bit of reading to prep for this, and one thing that just blew me away was that bread predates metal.
Yeah. I mean, it really puts things into perspective, right? We're talking about a time when humans were really just figuring things out, like agriculture, just scratching the surface of what we consider like culinary traditions today.
Exactly. I mean, It really puts things into perspective to think about, a loaf of sourdough being more ancient than like a sword.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So where do we want to begin with this journey?
Well, we've got a bunch of research lined up going all the way back to ancient Egypt.
Right. I mean, Egypt is a great place to start. There's evidence showing that sourdough was a pretty big deal there as early as 4000 BCE.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just like sustenance, like they depicted it in their art. Like imagine seeing a loaf of sourdough in an ancient Egyptian wall painting.
Wow. Okay. I've never thought about that before. That's pretty amazing to think that something we enjoy today has such ancient roots like that. I mean, are we talking pyramids old?
Oh, yeah. We're talking even older. I mean, there's this amazingly preserved loaf they found in Switzerland, dated back to 3500 BCE. Older than the pyramids. It shows just how widespread sourdough was.
So it sounds like it wasn't just an Egyptian thing. This was already global back then.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It wasn't confined to one region at all.
Mm.
Think about it. Sudanese kisra. It's a traditional fermented sorghum dough, right?
Right.
Or Ethiopian injera, a flatbread made from teff, all leavened with wild yeasts. Even Mexican pool. It's a fermented corn drink, but it uses that same principle.
Wow. So it seems like almost every culture has some kind of like sourdough tradition. How did it spread like that across continents?
Well, that's one of the cool mysteries, right? It's got to be migration, probably trade routes, people sharing knowledge with each other as they move and settle new places. I mean, people adapt, right? They're going to use local ingredients, adjust for climate, and that's how we see this incredible diversity in sourdough today.
Fascinating. It travels with people, evolving along the way,
Yeah.
like a culinary passport.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of travel, you know how sourdough came to America? Prospectors during the gold rush, they brought their starters with them, sometimes even panning for gold with the starter.
Whoa, really? That's crazy. I guess it makes sense, though. You're traveling all the way across the country.
Right. I mean, they called them sourdoughs because they were so attached to their starter.
That's cool. It wasn't just food. It was a connection to home, a symbol of resilience. Okay, so we've talked about Egypt, the global spread. Let's go back to Europe. I mean, sourdough is huge GE in European baking traditions.
Yeah. It's huge GE. And Europe is like a treasure trove of sourdough history.
Yeah.
Let's start with France. They have sourdough recipes that go as far back as the 17th century. And I'm not talking about basic instructions here.
Right.
These were really detailed, meticulous recipes. Shows their deep understanding of the whole fermentation process.
Yeah.
It's like a dedication to flavor, right? They really put in the time. It was more than just sustenance. It was art.
Yeah, so even centuries ago, the French were perfecting sourdough.
Yeah.
Crazy.
It is crazy. And think about this. France is known for the baguette today. Super quick rise, commercial yeast, all that. But they haven't forgotten sourdough at all.
Yeah.
In fact, they even have regulations in France about what can officially be called sourdough.
Oh, really? Wow.
That's dedication.
Shows how important it is to their culinary tradition. So what about other parts of Europe? I mean, was sourdough as big of a deal in other countries?
Oh, totally. Let's look at Germany, for instance.
Mm.
Commercial yeast was popular there, too. But sourdough, especially for rye breads, it was essential. And there's a scientific reason for it.
Oh, I'm intrigued.
Rye flour, it's different than wheat flour. Less gluten, harder to make a light and airy loaf. But the sourdough, the acidity in it, it actually prevents the starches in the rye from degrading. Helps with gluten development, gives it a much better texture.
Wow. So those early bakers, they really knew what they were doing. They figured this out without, the scientific knowledge we have today.
It's pretty amazing, right? Just observation and experimentation, passing that knowledge down over generations. And just like France, Germany also has regulations to protect the term sourdough.
So it was a big deal in Europe, a cornerstone of baking, influencing traditions for generations. Amazing.
It really is.
Now, I'm curious to dive into how sourdough manifests in different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are some unique examples?
Oh, let's get into that. There are some truly fascinating variations out there. So we've been talking about how sourdough has, traveled the world, adapted to different cultures. I think it's time to look at some really cool specific examples. Beyond those loaves of bread we usually think of, sourdough takes on all sorts of fascinating forms.
I'm ready to be amazed. What kind of unique sourdough creations are we talking about?
Okay, let's go to India. Ever heard of idale?
I don't think so, no.
It's this steamed savory cake made with fermented rice and lentil batter. And guess what? The fermentation uses naturally occurring wild yeasts and bacteria, just like sourdough.
Interesting.
It's like a breakfast staple in many parts of India. Shows you how sourdough principles can be applied to ingredients way beyond wheat.
Yeah, for sure. So it's not all about bread.
Nope. Think about dosa, too. Those thin, crispy crepes, also from South India. They use fermented batter, too. Gives it this slightly tangy flavor, super distinct.
Wow. So even within one country, you have all these variations on the sourdough theme. It's amazing how versatile this ancient technique is.
It's crazy, right? Okay, let's jump over to Africa now. Ethiopian cuisine. You've got injera, a spongy flatbread, kind of sour, made from teff. It's an ancient grain. And they use injera to scoop up stews, curries, all kinds of things.
I have heard of injera. Didn't realize it was sourdough, though. It's cool how different cultures incorporate it into their, everyday foods.
Right. And the variations are endless. In Sudan, you have kisra. It's this thin, fermented bread from sorghum, cooked on a hot clay griddle, usually served with dips and stews. Then there's Morocco with their erguf, a layered, flaky flatbread that's leavened with wild yeasts.
Whoa, this is blowing my mind. We're on, a culinary world tour fueled by sourdough.
I know, right? And even in Europe, beyond the classic French and German sourdoughs, there are tons of examples. Swedish sourdough pancakes, Finnish sourdough rye crackers, it's all connected.
Sourdough is everywhere, a true global phenomenon woven into so many cultures. It makes you wonder, though, how did people even discover sourdough in the first place?
The million-dollar question. And honestly, we don't really have a definitive answer, It was probably a combination of observation, experimentation, a little bit of luck, who knows? I mean, imagine early humans, they're mixing up their grains and they notice it's bubbling, fermenting on its own. And hey, the bread ends up lighter and tastier. So over time, they start figuring out how to harness this process, refining it, passing that knowledge down.
Yeah, so it was a gradual process of discovery and refinement. Makes sense.
Exactly. And like we've talked about, those early discoveries evolved, adapted over thousands of years, and boom, you get the crazy diversity we see in sourdough today.
Makes sense. But with all this diversity, are there any, common threads that connect all these sourdough traditions?
Absolutely. At its core, sourdough is all about harnessing wild yeast and bacteria, taking simple ingredients and transforming them into something complex and delicious. It's the power of fermentation. Humans have relied on it for thousands of years.
Right, so while ingredients and techniques might differ, the fundamental sourdough principles are universal.
Exactly, and that's part of what makes sourdough so appealing, I think. In a world of tech and mass production, you can still connect with this ancient process, make something special with your own two hands.
Yeah, I can see that. Like a return to authenticity, connecting with food origins.
Totally. And beyond all that, there's a sense of community, shared knowledge that comes with sourdough. People passing down their starters, techniques, creating a lineage that connects us to the past.
It's true. It's more than just food, it's a living heritage.
Exactly. And as we keep exploring the world of sourdough, we're not just learning about food, we're uncovering a part of ourselves, our shared human story.
Sourdough.
Huh.
A living heritage really makes you think about, that simple loaf of bread in a whole new way.
It does, doesn't it? And I think that's a big reason why it's having this, resurgence, this comeback. It's more than just the flavor,
Yeah.
It's connecting to something, deeper, a need for authenticity, tradition, in a world that can feel so disconnected.
Yeah, I get that. There's something about making sourdough. It's almost meditative. Slow, deliberate, patient. You have to pay attention.
That's it. Good things take time,
Yeah.
And the process itself, it's rewarding. But speaking of sourdough, we got to talk about San Francisco. It's the sourdough capital.
Oh, yeah. San Francisco sourdough, legendary. What makes it so special, though?
Well, San Francisco sourdough has this amazing history, right? It goes back to the gold rush, prospectors bringing their starters. Turns out the climate there, all that cool, foggy air, wild yeasts everywhere, it's the perfect sourdough incubator.
So it was the perfect storm, huh? History, geography, and a sprinkle of microbial magic. That's what made San Francisco sourdough.
Exactly. And those sourdough traditions that kept going, generation after generation, bakers perfecting their techniques, those unique starters capturing the essence of San Francisco. Like, it's terroir.
Terroir, is that a wine thing?
It is. But it applies to sourdough, too. Like wine grapes, those wild yeasts and bacteria, they're influenced by the environment, you know?
Yeah.
San Francisco's air, the water, the flour, they all play a role in shaping the flavor.
Wow. So San Francisco sourdough is really a reflection of the city itself, its history, its climate, its, what did you call it, microbial ecosystem.
Exactly. That's why it's so special. It's one of a kind, couldn't be made anywhere else. And today, there are bakeries still using starters over 150 years old, like Boudin Bakery, carrying on the tradition, preserving those flavors.
150 years old. Wow. That's just incredible. Like a living link to the past, passing from baker to baker.
It's amazing, isn't it? And that feeling of connection, I think that's what draws people to sourdough. We're part of a bigger story.
It really makes you appreciate all the work, the dedication of those early bakers who, created these traditions we still enjoy today.
I know, right? Sourdough, it's way more than just food. It's history, culture, a connection to nature. Even something as simple as a loaf of bread can hold so much, It's a journey of discovery, and of course, it's delicious.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into sourdough. We hope you've learned a thing or two, and maybe you'll look at that sourdough on your counter with a new appreciation. Or even try your hand at baking it yourself. Thanks for listening.